What colour is grass? Green. Of course it's green. But does it have to be green? I mean, this isn't green. Not all of this is green. And this isn't green either. I don't mean to say that chlorophyll is a social construct, but every single time I see someone do terraforming, they either use grass or moss. It doesn't have to be either of those, does it? So I've got 4 squares around me, and today we're going to try and ideate 4 different terrains without using grass or moss. So let's get into it. So the first mini terrain that we're going to build primarily uses brown as the base colour. And I also wanted to incorporate a tram into the build, like the ones in Amsterdam. The usage of brown actually allows for a greater contrast between the land and the bushes that we're going to add, not to mention the flowers. And we're probably going to add a tree at the corner for the sake of practicing making trees. So let's cover this area with some coarse dirt, and we'll be back when we're done. Now, this is what it looks like so far. It's more than a little plain, I must admit, but we're going to try and fix that by adding some topography to this area, by which I mean we're going to terraform. No! In any case, if you struggle with terraforming, like I do, something that you can do is to pull out a topography map. You might have seen one of these in geography class before, and in essence, it shows the altitudes of an area using lines and various labels. You can just copy the ridges of these maps onto your Minecraft world, and there you have it, some natural looking terrain. As you can see, we've made a small path off to the side, as well as tracks for the tram that we're going to add later on. But at the moment, it's all just coarse dirt, which looks rather boring. So we're going to pull out a bunch of brown blocks, and let's get to work. And we are done with the basic terrain. I think varying the colours made a world of difference. You notice that the areas with greater altitude are detailed with brighter blocks like packed mud and jungle wood, while areas that are in the shadows are detailed with darker blocks like dark oak. Still, it looks incomplete without some shrubbery, so let's go ahead and add some of that. Now, what we're doing is to pepper some bushes and lilacs somewhat sparsely. I don't want the area to be completely covered with greenery, and as the saying goes, sometimes less is more. In any case, though, flowering azalea leaves and lilacs make an excellent combination when it comes to flowers. I was originally planning to add alliums and small amethyst buds as well, but I came to realize that alliums stood out too much, while small amethyst buds were just a little too purple as compared to lilacs and flowering azalea. If you've watched my previous video on how to make a nice pond, you'll know that I like to vary the types of leaves that I use to make bushes. So in addition to using flowering azalea, I also use spruce leaves to give the bushes a bit of shadows. And we can't forget the occasional spruce sapling. They make for rather cute additions, so long as we remember to add a piece of string on top. Can't have them going into trees out of nowhere after all. And this is what it looks like. Let's go ahead and build that tree that we are planning to make. And we're done with the base landscape. Now it's time to build the tram. Just as a warning, I'm ridiculously horrible at building automobiles of any sort. So if this ends up nothing like how it's supposed to look, well, I just need to get good. Anyways, as you can see, we're using black terracotta to form the basic form of the tram. We can also add some gold accents using spruce planks, tons of white glass for the windows, and that's the basic structure done. After that, it's going to be the bumper, the roof, and the highlights. Now we're done with the tram itself, and we can build a cable that the tram attaches to. Now, if you're watching this video as sort of a guide, I just want to emphasize that you don't necessarily have to build a tram. There's a bunch of other elements that you can add to your build, some of which we will be exploring later on in this video, and there's no need to limit yourself. A fallen log can count as an element, and so can a bench, a lamppost, a tree stump, and so on. Be as creative as you like. In any case, we're done with this build. Overall, I think it's not too bad, though I ought to have considered the perspective a bit before building the tram, because as you can see, the tram is actually blocking quite a bit of the shrubbery. Nonetheless, the colours turned out to be quite nice. I might just use this block palette for a future build. Now that we're done with our first mini terrain, let's move on to our next square. For this build, I didn't actually make a draft sketch before building, partly because I was too lazy to do so, and partly because I already had a good idea of what I wanted to build. As you probably saw earlier, the main colour that we're going to use in this mini landscape is yellow. We're going to be incorporating a bunch of stuff into this, like bamboo, hay bales, yellow terracotta, and wheat, which will hopefully give us a nice variation of tones and hues. And that's about it for the basic topography. There's nothing particularly noteworthy about it, really. Now, we've got to actually add a bit of colour to the terrain. So, let's get into it. And we're done with another basic terrain. It does look considerably different from the other one, given just how lurid the yellow is. But anyway, we're making a path that meanders through this little area, so that we know where to place things like bushes and flowers later on. While we used oak, packed mud, and jungle wood for our previous paths, we're going to be using spruce here instead to create a greater contrast between the yellow grass and the path. And now that that's done, let's actually add the details. We're still going to be sticking to the yellow colour scheme, so we're using sunflowers and dandelions to decorate the terrain. Unfortunately, since you can't actually place flowers on terracotta or hay bales, we're going to have to use rooted dirt as our block for plant placing, since it blends in the best with the yellow. The bushes, on the other hand, are just about the same as our previous mini terrain, except that we'll use regular azalea leaves in conjunction with spruce instead of flowering azalea leaves. Now, because this is actually an autumn-themed terrain, one additional element that we're going to be adding here is a bunch of pumpkins. Just put a bit of acacia wood and some sea pickles, and there you have it. I didn't want to use regular pumpkins because they might blend in a little too much with the surrounding yellow, whereas with acacia wood, the contrast between the grass and the so-called pumpkins is more pronounced. I probably ought to have done this earlier when I was adding the basic colours to the terrain, but one more thing I did was to add little splotches of green to the yellow. Now, I know that I started the video by saying that grass doesn't need to be green, but technically it doesn't need to be yellow either. Besides, I used more atypical green blocks like melons and blocks of bamboo, which are closer to the lime than green, so it allows for quite a nice blend between the hay bales and the green stalks of the flowers. And with that, we're done with the base landscape. All that's left to do is to add a few touch-ups, like this wheelbarrow that took way too long to design, and this little street sign. And with that, we are done. Personally, I genuinely like this one a lot. I suppose that the autumn theme could have been reinforced by adding some trees, but I wanted to make this particular bit of terrain more like a plain than a forest. The colours do flow quite well with each other, although I must say, when I first showed this to my friend, she said it looked like cheese. And now, I can't unsee it. Does it ruin this build for you? Anyways, moving on to our third build. I actually wanted to try something a little different for this build, which is to build something that looks underwater, above water. It can be painful to try making a build underwater, even with respiration. So we're going to use cyan blocks to try and emulate the underwater effect. Apart from that, we'll also add a little shipwreck off to the side as an additional element. Honestly, when I was thinking about what design to make out of cyan grass, I was quite unsure how to go about it. But hopefully, this turns out alright. It did not turn out alright. So, I accidentally deleted my recording of me building half of the terrain when I was trying to free up storage space on my recording app. But in any case, while I can't get the footage back, I can go through with you guys what we've done so far. So we've got a one stone wall set up, as well as the scaffold of the second stone wall, and it's really just a medley of grey blocks. And if we get down to the ground, the main colour that you'll see is undoubtedly cyan, of which we use quite a few different blocks for, like warped wort, dark prismarine, and so on. Additional little details include the various different amethyst shards, the pitcher pots and the warped roots, the last of which I particularly like. It really helps to sell the underwater aesthetic. And that big chunk of dirt in the centre is where our shipwreck is gonna go. I'm really sorry about the footage, and I'll try my best not to delete my own footage in the future. But putting that aside, let's get back to building. We're going to use black stone, mud, basalt and deep slate to try and make the rest of this stone wall. And then we can add a couple of little corals on the sides. I was partly inspired by shell fungi when making these. And while shell fungi are decidedly not corals, they still fit in very well with the overall aesthetic of the terrain. Now, all that's left to do is the shipwreck. As ships are a type of vehicle, I struggled quite a bit with getting the basic shape of the ship down, and in the end, it still ended up looking a little wonky. Nonetheless, it was quite easy to apply the base colours after that, which was primarily made of grey blocks like tuff and unstripped pale oak. We also incorporated a couple of cyan blocks into the top of the shipwreck to create an underwater lighting effect. And last but not least, we finished the mast and the yard using cyan blocks as well. And we're done with our third mini terrain. Let's go ahead and take a look. I think this build could really use a bit of work, especially when it comes to the proportions of the shipwreck. If you take a look at it, it's really not symmetrical at all. But for an experimental build, it's not that bad. I think that if this terrain were to be done on a larger scale, it might actually look quite nice. Although, chances are that we have to block the sky from view, since the sky ruins the immersion a little. If all of this were to be done in a cave, it'd look a lot better. And finally, on to our last build. I didn't make a draft sketch for this, just like the second terrain, but I did have a couple of reference pictures, all of which are from the scene in Arcane where Caitlyn and Grayson compete against each other in a shooting contest. I rarely see custom winter biomes online, so I wanted to try my hand at it. So we've got the basic terrain done, and now we're going to hit the montage again as we set down the base colours. Let's go! And we're done with the snow layer. If we were to do this on a larger scale, maybe we could have added a little pond that's frozen over, but I don't think that we can add that in this small space. However, what we can add are small little patches of dirt, and within them, we can place a couple of ferns and the new wildflowers. I'm planning on making the trees with orange leaves, so the yellow of the wildflowers ought to complement the trees well. Once that's done, we can mark out where we're going to be placing our trees. We're going to place them at the corners of the square to avoid making the area look too cluttered. And with that, we're done. That's our first tree, second tree, third tree, fourth and fifth. You'll notice that we added a couple of bushes too, but I didn't manage to record that, so yeah. Anyways, we can add the shadows to the bottom of the trees, and we're done with the natural landscape. Now to move on to our additional elements, which in this build will be a tent. I probably ought to have used a reference picture when building this, but I suppose that still turned out alright in the end. Now for the final touch-ups, and we're done. Truth be told, I'm not fully satisfied with this build. It still looks a little bit too plain for my liking. If I could, I'd have added a couple of boulders, ledges and moss around the area to make the area seem a little more natural. And perhaps I ought to have planned this build out a little more. Still, it's not as if it looks bad. Unironically, I think a good place to build a larger version of this will be in a basalt delta. Not only is the skybox nice and grey, but it also has the ash particles falling from the ceiling, which can look like snowflakes. So you could also emulate the same effect in a proper snow biome. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I do hope that you've gotten a couple of new ideas from this video. As always, feel free to comment any video suggestions below. I'll make sure to read them. Have a good day, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!